We're going to do an overview book of Micah. So we're looking at another minor prophets. We talked about the difference in the prophets, whether they're major or minor, just somebody decided to label major and minors, but it's based upon the size of the book. And so Micah is probably one of the longer, a few more chapters than a lot of the other minor prophets, several of the others. There's not that many minor prophets. So we go to our introduction. It says the author is Micah the prophet, and go to Micah 1:1. That's what's supposed to be there. So if you have a pen, go ahead and fill that in. It says the word of the Lord came to Micah of Morsheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, which he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. And so, when you look at this, we have a time stamp. We're going to talk about that here in a few minutes. But there's 3 kings that are mentioned, right? And so he prophesied during these kings. One thing, we had a change of president several months ago, right? Do things change? Do people's mindset and perspective change a little bit? It does a little bit. And so that's something maybe it'd be interesting to go back and look at. And I kind of thought about that as we've been going through this. As far as look at the nation, because when you think about the southern kingdom, we understand they're the only part, or we have the north and the south, they're the only part of Israel that had some good kings, right? And so, but like when we think about Hezekiah, and I know our study's not Hezekiah tonight, but go back and you look at what Hezekiah did when he became king, there's a lot of spiritual ignorance in Jerusalem. And so when I think about that, I wonder about when you read this list, and we see Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, there was changes. One of the things, if we were to go tonight and look at 2 Kings chapter 18, one of the things that Hezekiah did was he tore down the high places, right, where they worshipped idols. And he destroyed images that they were worshiping, using for idol worship. And so, as I think about that, and I look at some of the things that the prophets were writing, when I think about, we really don't need to go here, but anyway, I'll just mention it. If there's a question, we go there. But in 1 Kings 18:19, what you see is that Hezekiah, one of the things, it tells us that Hezekiah, there's no other king like Hezekiah since David, right? Or he was compared to David as a king, right? He tore down the high places. When Assyria came to take Jerusalem, when that was their desire, then one of the things that the Assyrians noticed was that Hezekiah had tore down the high places. But what the Assyrians, the Sennacherib, the Assyrians didn't understand was they believed that Hezekiah was unreligious because he tore down the high places, and the Assyrians believed that the high places were used to worship God. And so when I think about that, it's interesting, or I think about this, I say, when the outside world who knows nothing about the Bible or Scripture or religion or true worship, they say, how or why do you do what you do the way you do it? And there's a misunderstanding. So even in the Old Testament, the Jews, Hezekiah was doing great things and bringing Israel forward, which when you think about Micah and him prophesying and saying, and I think about, Hezekiah, him prophesying during a time, we know that Isaiah and Hezekiah had communication with one another. They knew each other and they spoke. And so these prophets and Hezekiah, being their contemporaries, they're feeding off of one another, right? And so I wonder if, when Micah, this is a long statement, right? I wonder if Micah, when Hezekiah started doing the things that he was doing, helping Jerusalem turn back to God, I wonder how excited some of the prophets would have gotten to see some of the positive change. Does that make sense? That's a long, confusing statement. Anyway. All right. So, we see that there's a prophecy that Micah saw concerning. And so the warning is that, in fact, you jump ahead. We're jumping all over tonight. Sorry for that. But the main point, outline of the book, we see the prediction of judgment, the prediction of restoration, and the plea for repentance. Right? That's one way to outline the book. But we see that. What did Micah know was going to happen to the nation of Israel? Yeah, they're going to go into captivity. But I think that maybe, like say, when Micah saw Hezekiah, probably he said, boy, there's some glimmer of hope for this nation. Right? What do you think about that? We need that. So we're still in the author of the book, point 1. The author of the book, or this is the minor prophet Micah. We know that his name is who is like Yahweh, who is like Jehovah. Micah is a prophet of the downtrodden and exploited people of Judea. And we look at this, and we talk about, when we see Samaria and Jerusalem, we're talking about the southern regions, is what we're talking about here. And that's who he was a prophet to. Micah exposes judges being bought with bribes and merchants who use deceptive weights. We taught from Proverbs for a while back, and one of the things mentioned in Proverbs is the immorality of using what? Unjust judgments or weights. And we see here, one of the things that we might have time to look at is Micah mentioning that we see the corruption in government, right? And I know that's a big thing today in our nation that we're dealing with. It there's a lot of discussion about, right? But corruption is never a good thing, is it? Okay, so you think about that. 4.4, his hometown is mentioned. Look at verse 14 of chapter 1. We see here, therefore you shall give presents to Morsheth, Gath, the houses of Agzib shall. I lost my place here. The houses of Agzib shall be a lie to the kings of Israel. I got to think about that one. It was located 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem on the border of Judah and Philistine near Gath. So that's what we're talking about, and that's what's mentioned here. Okay. Do we realize, and think about this, this is 40 miles. Okay? So when we talk about where you're at, we drove 811 miles Tuesday night. Well, not just Tuesday night, but not into Wednesday morning. But when we think about how big America is, the Bible lands are much smaller, right? And so what is a day's drive for us, you think about a day's walk for them. You think about the Amish, right? We see this. It's mentioned here how far it is. It was located 25 miles. The Amish travel 25 miles. They'll go down to Walmart, and they'll go to Spickard and stuff. It's a day's travel. And so when you think about that, we say, well, 25 miles, how many of us drove 25 miles tonight? Andy and Tara, almost tonight, right?
40 miles.
But see, and so when we think about these things, we're still talking about a day's travel apart, but not a terrible long distance. Go to Micah 3 and verse 8. And as with all the prophets, we understand that they're a mouthpiece of God or for God to his people. It says, but truly, I am full of power by the Spirit of the Lord, and justice and might to declare to Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin. And so, who gave Micah the power? If we were to read from, Debbie's right, if we were to read from Matthew 28 and verse 18, then that's the beginning of what we know as the Great Commission. And so we hear that all power is given unto me in heaven and earth, right? And so if you've ever heard a preacher preach a sermon or teach a Bible class on that word power, all power is given to me, what's another word we interchange?
Power.
Come on, Debbie, I know you know it. What? The word. Well, that's one is authority, right? So when we talk about that, what we see here is who gave him power. God did. But also, what he's saying, he says, I'm full of authority. Think about that. When Micah was speaking, he was given authority. Who gave him the authority? by the Spirit of the Lord, and of justice and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression and to Israel the sin. And so we think about that. Micah had authority to say the things he said, right? And so I think this is important because I don't know if we've noted this in our study up to this point. When you go and you look at Paul's letters, for example, right? One of the things Paul does in dealing with, for example, the letter to the Corinthians, the first letter to the Corinthians, is he establishes his apostolic authority. And one of the things we see there is he makes a statement, and he said that if you don't fix these, I'll have to come with a, what? A rod, right? Remember that? And so you think about that, the authority that Micah has to say these things. Point 6, during his years of prophecy, the nation was crumbling from the inside and from the outside. Probably should put outside instead of just out, until its fall in 721 BC. And what was causing the fall of the nation? Okay, morality. And it's interesting because a lot of our focus, our minds, and like I say, we don't want to get political in Bible class, but a lot of our focus we're talking, and the discussions are about the corruption as about money, right? We hear things like tariffs, and we're not talking about whether we're for them or against them. We're talking about tariffs and money being misspent and all this kind of stuff. And we say, boy, if we can fix this, which it is good things to fix, right? If there's corruption and money being spent wrong, I think it's a great idea to fix it. But here's the thing. What causes the action of corruption? The greed. How about the heart? Which is a greed, is a condition of the heart. And so, we still go back to the situation. If we want to fix America, how do we fix America?
Or not even...
Got to get back to God.
Got to get back to God. If we restored morality, and so some of the things, we won't have time to look at all this tonight, not this, for example, Micah, but other places, one of the things we see is that the nation of Israel, and some of the prophets state, they're poor. Why are they poor? Because of immorality. Okay, it happens. So you think about that. So, anyway, the day of the book, this time was a period of great social injustice. We realize that shows social injustice. And we do not know when he wrote the book, but we know the prophecies range from probably 735 to 710. Of course, time's counting backwards back then. Micah was contemporary with Hosea, and that is that the first prophet we looked at? I think the first or second it was. And Isaiah was in the court in Jerusalem. And so that's one of the things I mentioned a few minutes ago, was Isaiah and Hezekiah had communication with each other. And Isaiah delivered some messages to Hezekiah of great comfort, because Hezekiah, we see the example, if we want to go there, we could, but in 2 Kings 18 and 19, we see that Hezekiah, because of what was happening, he had to go to the temple. He chose to go to the temple and pray about the situation, right? How did Hezekiah realize it was going to be okay? God spoke to Isaiah, because that was his job, right? So I think we see a correlation there in principle, in that the cooperation, when you get to the first century, on Tuesday mornings we're studying 1 Corinthians. We're going to be there here shortly, and we study about the miraculous gifts in chapters 12, 13, and 14, is that just because someone could speak in tongues didn't mean that they could interpret tongues. So when you had someone that could speak in tongues and someone that could interpret tongues, when they went somewhere together, one could speak in a foreign language, one could understand in a foreign language, then they could speak to each other in their own language, they could work together, and the gospel would benefit. What we see here, what we're mentioning here about Isaiah and Hezekiah, is that they cooperated, right? And so all these prophets that we're studying about had the same mission. Some of them knew each other, some of them didn't know each other. Anyway, we think about that. We have key words in the book: judgment and restoration, right? Is judgment a good thing or a bad thing? Depends on what side you're on, right? A judgment from God would never be a bad thing if you're on the right side, right? But what you have is the judgment would allow for the restoration to take place, right? And so we think about the great restoration of Israel. When they came back, they were much closer to what God had designed for his people to be when they came back from captivity. And that was the segue that allowed for the establishment of the church, and Daniel writes about that. Yes?
It's not really about sides, it's about the side of truth.
Yeah, it's just right or wrong. That's all it was. Yeah, exactly. Micah 6 and verse 8. There's a song we sing in our song books. I have no clue what song it is in these books. I'm still learning these song numbers. I am on the Lord's side, Master, here am I. Think about that. Yeah, that's what it's about, being on the right side.
6:8.
6:8. Yeah, you want to read it?
He has shown you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God.
Okay. A couple weeks ago, we talked a little bit, or I mentioned about Jeremiah 10:23. O Lord, I know that the way of man not in himself is not in man that walketh to direct his own steps. What's Micah say here, what Angie just read? He has shown you, O man, what is good. Philip Patton, passed away a couple years ago. But when he was here, one of the things he talked about was the idea of good. And he done a study, and I don't remember if it was during our training session for teaching Bible class or whether it was in his lesson. I remember him talking about it. The idea, and what we see happening here to the nation of Israel, in order for the restoration to happen, they had to go through some difficult times, right? And we think about that, and so when we think about a surgery, is that good or bad, Ron? Jury's still out. But the difficult time we go through the surgery is designed for better days later. Okay. And so, one thing Philip mentioned about good is good doesn't always mean the easiest way, right? So I think about that with this, because Israel's going to have some scars as a result of what's happening, and when they go away, it's going to allow them to rebuild better. And so that's what happened. Nehemiah, you think about Nehemiah, the wall builder. We say, well, the wall was torn down because of the armies that came in and took Jerusalem. Yeah, but the temple was not able to be reconstructed and worship in this condition of Israel right now. So those things had to happen. Those things had to be torn down and rebuilt better. Micah 7:18. Micah 7:18. Oh, I didn't even finish the rest of that verse, some other things. We're back at 6:8 real quick. Sorry about that. He says, the question that's asked, what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God, right? What were they not doing? Those things, right? So they weren't doing good. All right, sorry about that. 7:18. Who is God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over the transgression of the remnant of his heritage? So, what was, again, the whole theme of the prophets is to get Israel back to where they needed to be, right? Because they weren't where they needed to be. So that's what we see. So the book closes with hope, the verse we just read. Why? Because the word remnant, a remnant. Was everyone in the nation going to be a part of that remnant? No. But those that had penitence, right? And that's what we see coming back from captivity with Ezra and Nehemiah.
If you finish that or read the rest of that verse.
Oh, I missed it. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I think it might clarify.
You're right. I cut off.
No, you're good.
He does not retain his anger forever because he delights in mercy. Thank you, Tara.
And the next verse too is,
He will again have compassion on us and will subdue your iniquities. You will cast all our sins into the depths of the sea, and you will give truth to Jacob and mercy to Abraham, which you have sworn to our fathers from the days of old. Thank you, Tara. I didn't even realize I missed the end of 18. Why was Abraham chosen? Was he the strongest? Was he the smartest?
Because of his faith.
Because of his faith. That's it. Right? He was chosen. And so when you think about that, the mercy to Abraham, these are his descendants. And so God would show them the same kindness they showed Abraham if they were like Abraham. And so, okay. Outline of the book, we looked at this. Have 3 chapters. The prediction of judgment. Then you have the prediction of restoration. And then the plea for repentance. If you go to the back side on this outline, I've been putting these barns because I think they've got some good information that were aside from some of my notes. But if you look on the left side of the page, just under, about halfway down, that first column, it says 1/3 of Micah's book exposes the sins of his own countrymen. 1/3 of the book depicts the punishment God is about to send. And 1/3 holds out the hope of restoration once the punishment has ended. And so we see that there's hope, there's light at the end of the tunnel. And that's what Micah writes about as he finishes his book. So, does that mean everybody repented? Think about that. The last book that we looked at was Jonah. We don't know how Jonah ended up. We know how most of Israel ended up. Some of them repented and they are allowed to be a part of the remnant, so that's important. So, go back to the other side. We've got some verses we'll look at. What we see here is there's great oppression. So Micah 2, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Woe to those who devise iniquity and work out evil on their beds. At morning light they practice it, because it is in the power of their hand. They covet fields and take them by violence, also houses, and seize them. So they oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance." And so one of the things we started out here is in point 3 under A, as we began, Micah exposes judges being bought with bribes and merchants who use deceptive weights. That was the sentence we have here. Chapter 2, we see that whoever was doing this had authority in the nation, right? It says, "Woe to those who devise iniquity." What does it mean to devise iniquity? Create sin, right? We're talking about the pre-planning of doing something evil. Okay? If we go back and we look at Genesis 6, which we don't have to, but one of the things it tells us that the thoughts of men's hearts were on evil. How often? Continually. What do they think about? Right? All of us makes mistakes, right? We're talking about a nation that went home and thought about how they could do wrong. Right? They had pre-planned it. Goes on. It says, and they worked out evil in their beds. That's what we're talking about. At morning light, they practice it. What's it mean at morning light? All day? Here's the thing. One of the things in preaching school, it's amazing how much you remember, and it's scary how much you forget. One of the things I remember, one of the instructors saying, they said, do a study on things that happen early in the morning, right? And some of the people who got up early to serve God. One of the examples was Abraham. When Abraham was sent to sacrifice Isaac, he got up early in the morning. Right? What do you normally do early in the morning? Work.
Right.
Important or unimportant things?
The opposite of what you do at night, which is usually, it could be things that you could get in trouble in.
So normally when you get up early in the morning, you say, these are the important things I'm going to get done today, right? On our list of things we have the stuff we have to get done. So that's the stuff we try to start with in the morning. What's it mean that they got up? The first thing they did in the morning was do what? Practice. What were they excited to do? It's not, and we say we have a coined phrase in America, idle hands are the, yeah, right? Okay? These people, when they went to bed at night, and that's what we see in the beginning of verse 1, woe to those who devise iniquity and work out evil on their beds. When they go to sleep at night, they wake up early excited to do what? Commit sin. Think about that. Then when you get to verse 2, they covet fields. Is covetousness a sin? It's a sin, okay? And take them by, how'd they take them? Violence. Right? They just took what they wanted. I think about a principle or the idea of a bunch of gangbangers. If they want something, what do? They go take it, right? And they wake up early in the morning to do it. It says also houses, they seize them, so they oppress a man and his house, and a man and his inheritance. What we see in verse 2 is no one was stopping them. They had the authority, whether it was given or taken. Israel let them do it. You think about that. The gross immorality. You know, there's cities in our nation that have areas that police won't go. You realize that? We have areas in our nation. We have areas and we have cities, parts of cities, where police don't go. Right? I had a police officer tell me he worked in a large city one time, and he says there was places they didn't go, and if they went there, they were just there. Right? And he said the corruption, he said certain cars you didn't pull over, right? Because you'd be shot. You pulled them over. Okay? And so we see this. They had the authority, not only did they have the gall to do it, but they had the authority because no one was stopping them in Israel. That's the corruption that was going on. How do you like to live there? Anyway, that was God's people, how far they'd come or gone. Micah 3, 11 and 12 says, her heads judge for a bribe, her priests teach for pay, and her prophets divine for money. Yet they lean on the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? No harm can come to us. Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed like a field. Jerusalem shall become heaps of ruin, and the mountain of the temple like the bare hills of the forest. So, we see in verse 11, we see the situation. What was the situation? One of the questions I think we have in our country right now is whether or not judges are being bought or not. Is that an appropriate question to ask? Sure. Absolutely. Right? It is. Okay. And so it says in the day, no, wrong verse. Go back to it. It says, her heads judge for a bribe. They say you want something. Verses we just read in verse 2, you have people taking stuff by violence. If they got in trouble, what would they have to do to get out of trouble?
Buy it.
Buy it. Right. Not buy the judge, not the land, right, Andy? No.
Yeah.
It says her priests teach for what? We were traveling Saturday. We drove by a mega church. I don't remember where it was, but I looked over. Looked like a big corporate building, and the signage on it and everything looked very corporate. The whole facility looked very corporate. And I said, oh, look at that new business. Because that's all it was, right? And here we see a situation where religion had become a what? Become a business. Scary situation. And her prophets divine for money. What's it mean, her prophets divine for money?
They want money for what they're going to tell you. God tells you.
If you want a message from God, put your money here. Think about that. I'm sure that they were real good, true prophets, weren't they? Anyway, yet they lean on the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? No harm can come to us. Who did they think was protecting them? God. Right, because they were God's people.
They thought they could do no wrong.
That's right. Which is, I think, is similar to what we talked about 2 weeks ago. Job, I think there's a little bit of connection in mindset. Maybe not. Tell me if I'm wrong. But Job felt that God was a national God. And so when he got in the ship, he said, I'll sail away from God. So he believed that as long as he was outside of God's presence, he was safe from doing what God wanted him to do. Okay? So the mindset here is that they believed that God was a national God and was going to bless them as a nation, not as a godly people. Because they said, we're God's people. Whatever we do, God's going to bless because he is our God. Well, he wasn't their God the way God wanted to be their God. So, because of this, Zion will be plowed under. All right, 2 more minutes, sorry. Micah 4, 1 and 2. Says, it shall come to pass in the last days or latter days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established on the top of the mountains, shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow into it. Many nations will come and say, come us, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways. We will walk in his paths. For out of Zion the law shall go forth, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many people, rebuke strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Anybody read that before in another book? Isaiah chapter 2. Read the beginning of Isaiah chapter 2. We don't have time, but that's where it's at. And so, you think about the people were hearing the same message from more than one person. And that's important. That's important when people hear the same message from more than one person. Micah 7:7, therefore, I will look to the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will do what? Hear me. That's if they have a penitent heart. We see that situation, their salvation at the end. Okay. Any questions or comments?